Okay, great. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our last general body meeting for the semester. Just a few things. If you're not a member and you're interested in becoming a member, please reach out to myself, Darian, and here's my email for more information about being a member and to get the membership application. Also, for members, we're looking to expand our e-board. If you're interested in becoming more involved in NLA and gaining leadership experience, you can reach out to myself or Amber, who's the campus director, and we can assist with the application for e-board. We're looking for people for various positions in the spring semester. And so it's just a great way to become more involved and to expand your leadership skills. NLA does provide an internship match. It is exclusively for NLA GSU members. You must be conducting an internship for CNP certification or academic credit, and the application is available year-round. And I'm going to turn it over to Professor O'Kane, who will introduce our guest speaker.
All right, great. Well, it's my pleasure to introduce Bonnie Hardage, whom I've had the opportunity to work with in the past. And Bonnie has an interesting career. I'll introduce kind of how she got into fundraising and foundation work, but I'll also go back and talk about her earlier career, because I think those of us who find ourselves in fundraising, especially in nonprofits, we usually get there by a very circuitous route. I mean, very few of us go to school and come home and tell our mom and dad that I want to grow up to be a fundraiser. We more or less kind of fall into it, so to speak. But Bonnie is currently the executive director of the Jesse Parker Williams Foundation, where she's been for 4.5 years. Prior to that, she was president of the Mercy Care Foundation, and prior to that, director of major gifts and campaign at Shepherd Spinal Center. And then prior to that, she was at St. Joseph's Mercy Foundation as the capital campaign director. Those are sort of her bona fides in fundraising and foundation work. But it's interesting because her background is actually in graphic design, marketing and graphic design. She has a degree from the University of Georgia, some post-baccalaureate work at Cooper Union in New York City, and then went to work actually at St. Joseph's Hospital as the marketing and graphic design specialist, not as a fundraiser. And so somewhere along the way, being there as the graphic, and you probably have the chance to work on, I would imagine, some campaign materials and different things like that, became known to the fundraising folks, and then they reached out to you, and the rest is history. So you sort of never know exactly where that path is going to go. And Bonnie, if you wanted to even share a few thoughts about that before you get into your presentation, because obviously the students are looking at how to chart their course or a career, and any advice and wisdom would be great. But we're so honored to have you, and I would just remind our students that we will be recording the session and making it available to you, or if there are others who said they weren't able to join, also to them. So Bonnie, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and thanks everyone. Yes, I always say follow your heart because it'll lead you in places you'll never dream. But even before St. Joe's, my first job after getting my bachelor in fine art was at the Weather Channel. So I stayed there for about 3 years and recognized really quickly that if I was going to have to work and raise children, I wanted to do more meaningful work. And so I thought, gosh, working for a hospital would be meaningful. And back in the day, opened up the AJC and found that marketing and graphic design job that you were talking about. And the rest is history. But I just love healthcare and couldn't imagine being in any sector because of how meaningful it is to be part of organizations that are filling such a tremendous need in healing, patients and families, and especially at this time where we're seeing how health can impact all factors in our lives. It has been a wonderful journey, and I'm feel truly blessed. So I'll go ahead and share. I do have my chat open, so if you want to put questions in the chat, I'm happy to kind of monitor that. Okay, so there we go. So can you guys see my presentation?
We can.
Okay, and I am...
Can you go fuller screen?
Fuller screen.
Because I know that some of your slides have smaller print.
Yes, and on my screen it's very small too. So I wonder, okay, hold on, maybe
The slideshow, and it would go
yeah,
up.
okay. Sorry about this.
It's okay.
For some reason the buttons are not working.
All right. Well, we can still see it, so that's good.
Okay. So well, that's annoying that my buttons are not working.
We're good. We're good.
And if I could just jump in for one second, sorry to interrupt, but I tried hitting full screen on my end, and it made it big on my screen.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but
Okay, and then I can't see the chat feature anymore. So
yeah, if you do that,
yeah,
we'll leave it. That's okay. Leave it like this. We're good, and yeah.
Okay. So a little bit about Jessie Parker Williams Foundation. I started about 4.5 years ago, but it has been a foundation really since the early 1990s, and it is a healthcare access foundation for women and children in the Fulton, DeKalb, Gwinnett, Clayton, and Cobb counties, and it was created from a bequest from 1924 from Mrs. Williams, who was married to Jessie Parker Williams. But she wanted to leave her fortune, because they didn't have any children, to create a hospital for women and children and name it in his loving memory. And so in the early 40s, right next door to Crawford Long, the Jessie Parker Williams Hospital opened. It took about maybe 12 years to settle her estate during the Great Depression. But they operated, and I've talked to doctors who trained on the floor of Crawford Long, who was the Jessie Parker Williams floor. It eventually moved into the hospital, and then they got out of the hospital business in the early 90s and created the foundation. We're about a $30 million foundation, and funny enough, when I worked at Mercy Care, one of our strategic initiatives was to integrate behavioral health into our primary care clinics. And if you don't know about Mercy Care, it's the only federally qualified healthcare center in Atlanta, specifically for people living in homelessness. And so they're the doctors in the homeless shelters at City of Refuge, Gateway. They're in Mess Ministries now in Cobb County, which is pretty exciting. And then they also have two owned clinics, one in Chamblee and one right across from, on Decatur Street across from the MARTA station. And so removing the social determinants of health and being able to care for people who are living in homelessness and struggling with the type of adversity that brings to an individual's life. We needed to have kind of a one-stop shop in a community health setting. So they're dentists, they're mental health professionals, they're physical health professionals, case management, and it's exciting that they're getting ready to build affordable housing so that they have a place to house temporarily their patients while they're connecting them to services and more stability. So Jessie Parker Williams Foundation was one of the seed funders of that behavioral health integration. And so that's how I learned about the foundation, and then joined their team in 2016. We are intentional about 4 areas: primary care, mental health, healthy behaviors and prevention, as well as dental care, oral care. And we place a focus, though, on integration, because when you have school-based health, you can care for the child in the school and improve seat time for learning and continuity of care at a place where the child is most of the day. Integrated behavioral health removes stigma about mental health in the primary care setting, and it better supports primary care physicians who might not be trained in mental health, but increasingly are seeing more and more mental health issues, and they can operate in kind of like a hub, a team approach with the patient in the center. So however we can remove those social determinants to be able to provide for patients who have barriers to access to healthcare, that's the type of things that we're funding. And when in 2017, we kind of put a stake in the ground around health equity. And so I've been working to get more intentional about moving away from just traditional medical care and maybe larger health systems who have endowments and insurance revenue, a diverse patient population who can balance the revenue pie to be sustainable, and moved more into really vulnerable populations who may live in communities that don't have access to doctors or even a CVS on the corner, and what nonprofits were in those communities, specifically the child well-being heat map that the United Way has done such a phenomenal job of communicating and capturing data around. We really started looking at those red areas around child well-being and how our investments could, be targeted. And at the same time, we were measuring leaders of color, nonprofit leaders of color, and were we investing in their missions and their organizations? Just measuring and making sure that we had a diverse portfolio of nonprofits, that we weren't kind of swaying one way or the other. And I'm happy to say that, over the past 3 years, we've been averaging 30 to 40% of our portfolio. We're investing in nonprofit leaders of color. And unfortunately, the pandemic really shined a light on that because we all know that there are different systems set up for success, and the way that we navigate the world has privilege or extra barriers to access to relation, to capital, to health outcomes, even, and access. And so when you look at those historical policies and how they're still playing out today, we really need to, and I felt like the foundation needed to be intentional about those investments. What the pandemic did, though, was really kind of shine a light on all the disparities that we knew were happening, but it exacerbated 100 times, how to move through getting the pandemic behind us, and we're still in it. So because of the pressure points of the school not being kind of like that hub for services anymore for students, the funders recognized that nonprofits were going to be asked to step up and adapt like they had never done before. Even to the point where in the healthcare sector, the community clinics lost their volunteer providers because they were at risk for COVID. And so volumes dropped, and then their medical providers dropped as well. So they have been stringing services together to meet increased need with less funds from fundraising and special events, as well as just added burden. We've seen some mental health professionals pivot and start to deliver food to homes and provide well check visits at the homes for families, and then do services at home or through telehealth once they built up capacity to do that. I'm kind of looking at this, as the Industrial Revolution, where we have seen a tremendous amount of innovation and transformation in a short amount of time. And unfortunately, there's been too many lives lost during this time, but we have seen improvements in access to care because we're meeting patients where they are, typically in their homes, but our grantees are meeting the patients where they are. No-show rates have dropped. Compliance rates have increased. Medication compliance, because of the outreach and just having to do things differently, more on a personal level versus a systemic level, has improved. So I'm hoping that we really learn some lessons here as far as healthcare delivery goes and how to really think about those vulnerable students, patients, workers who may not have been seen before. For philanthropy, it's been a sea change as well in transformation. And so some of the things early on over the summertime, the Council on Foundations made a pledge that some foundations took up to basically remove barriers to nonprofits. So to allow grant resources, you might have had programming funds or grants, just release those to general operating so the nonprofit would have flexibility during this time of strain. We adopted, Jesse Parker Williams adopted a lot of these. We were pretty heavy on grant evaluation. We provided consultants to support our grantees in capturing data around outcomes. And we basically said, don't worry about the reports over the summertime, just carry those forward to 1-year reports and just do the best you can. If you had pledges, that were outstanding, some foundations had the capacity to do early payouts just to get cash flow to the nonprofits. And then there were others that basically said, we'll do an extension and we'll add on another year to our commitment because we know you're doing good work and we know you're strained financially. And so that was a real relief as well. And then everybody redirected any funding they had left for 2020 to COVID response, emergency response efforts. And so, and then I mentioned just suspending or postponing the requirements for grantee reporting. So that lifted a lot of burden off the nonprofit. And it was something that funders like this space, and they thought they couldn't change in the past because they needed all those requirements. But then we showed ourselves and our trustees very quickly that we can change on a dime when it's necessary. And so I think this has been a really great lesson for funders to say, even though you have these frameworks that you're working under, you can have flexibility and be nimble. And so when we're building back into, the new normal, what can we keep from this time and make it easier on nonprofits so that they can do their mission work? And so moving forward, we've kind of looked at this as, okay, so now, are you still there? Okay. I may need your help because it's, okay. It's not changing now.
Amber, can you?
Which slide do you want, Bonnie?
Third one.
I'll stop sharing, and it's just,
and let Amber share, and then you can,
Okay.
I just have the files saved. Which one's the third one?
Oh, it's the PowerPoint presentation.
Oh,
So I'll answer Aisha's question. I always, when I have interns or I'm mentoring someone, I always say it's kind of like dating. Your career is kind of like dating. You have to learn what you don't want to do, and then what you do want to do kind of navigates you through that. So just trust that any position that you are in at this certain time is feeding you and teaching you, and opening up opportunities for a transition or transfer into the nonprofit sector. But I'm happy to kind of talk about that more at the end. So the PowerPoint presentation that is named GSU Grad Nonprofit Studies. If you have that, I think this is the Center for Civic Innovation. Thank you for help. I appreciate you guys helping me.
Yeah, of course. Not a
is
problem.
going
we've learned to have a backup, obviously.
So third, so I was going to say, yeah, third, there you go. And so the way the funders are looking at the pandemic and navigating through the pandemic is kind of like disaster recovery and response and recovery. So you have crisis response, and then you have recovery, and then you have rebuilding back better. And I would say that a lot of crisis response has already been granted out, either individually through funders or through the Community Foundation for Greater Atlanta, as well as United Way. And so now in a lot of the meetings that we're talking about, because we have a statewide association too called the Georgia Grantmakers Alliance, they're focused around education, mental health, food access, housing, because we know we're kind of looking at an eviction crisis coming up, and then policy and advocacy. And so we can move through the presentation, and then I'll go to the other files if we have time. But one of the things that the Georgia Grantmakers Alliance is really trying to focus on is that philanthropy is not a separate sector from the nonprofits, that we're one sector. And when we combine all of our assets in the community and across the state, we're a pretty powerful sector. And so when we're climbing out of this pandemic, we need to be strengthening and sustaining the nonprofit sector so that we're able to recover in an inclusive manner that helps keep as many nonprofits functional during the pandemic, but then stronger after the pandemic. And so there was a time, and I think these links are live, but I can also send them in an email, the executive summary. But basically what this document outlines is there was a period of acceleration to address the crisis at hand. And then there's going to be a part of transition where folks are kind of finding their ground and still operating so that people have access to whatever the sector is, whether it's food, housing, economic training and development, school, healthcare. And then we'll ramp down when the vaccine is implemented and we've got some safety against the pandemic. And then during this time, though, nonprofits are going to have to kind of do some prep and look at how long their cash flow is, what kind of business strategies they can deploy to be resilient through the pandemic and even afterwards, because we've learned a lot about how to maneuver through these times of crises together at the community level. And then when we're recovering, how do we make that recovery so that it doesn't create more disparities in racial equity and health equity and education equity? How do we create new systems that are vulnerable and they're reducing the disparities instead of contributing to them? So the next slide. So this is just a snapshot, and I think this was in August, of the funding that has been awarded to Georgia from funders. And you can see there's been about $135 million. There's probably more now, but the majority, and this is a phenomenon that I find so fascinating just because I've always done work in Atlanta, but because the money is in Metro Atlanta, the majority of the money, that most of the money gets awarded to Atlanta. And as a result, the rural parts of Georgia really do suffer. And I've done some collective impact work with an organization called Resilient Georgia. And what I'm finding is with that money comes competition, and the collaboration is a little bit difficult in Metro Atlanta amongst nonprofits, whereas when you move to Savannah or Athens or Augusta, you don't have the money and the power play, and the community is working on a shoestring budget. They're more apt to collaborate together and kind of do more with less, but they're all in for their neighbors. And so it's been interesting to see how the response and recovery or crisis response has been in rural settings. We're on one hand really lucky to be in Atlanta, but on the other hand, I think they have more of a community collective partnership of support, whereas it's very fragmented or siloed from, community to community. So that's something that I think is going to change moving out of this as well. Next slide. So if you haven't heard, I just threw this in, if you haven't heard of, health and what goes into your health, most of our health is not tied to access to healthcare. It's only about 20%. And this is what they call the social determinants of health. And so 30% are tied to healthy behaviors, food access, addiction, tobacco use, risky sexual behavior. 10% is your environment, so pollution, water, violence in your community. And then 40% is socioeconomic factors, which is the community safety, income, family social support, job status, and education. So I think the pandemic has shown a light on this because of the impacts that it's made. And so moving forward, if you'll go to the next slide, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation really supports the concept of health in all policies. And we were kind of flat-footed with this pandemic because public health was not a priority. And so we didn't have stockpiles of PPE. We didn't have the infrastructures in place to address the technology gaps, the internet disparities for access of school and healthcare, and then all the other disparities we see that have a true impact on the long-term outcomes of our neighbors. And so next slide. The real trick is how do you come together instead of working as an independent nonprofit or an independent foundation? How do you come together to really address these factors that are really proving to be larger than any organization can solve, even the government can solve? And so it requires a lens of public-private partnerships, shared alignment with a vision for communities. And that's when you can really start to impact county level population health outcomes and start to move the needle. And it's been a real challenge, I think, for communities to do this, or even hospitals to do this, because they don't have the outreach into the community. And I think what we're learning from the pandemic is those community-based organizations are so critical because they have the trust of the neighbors. and voice of the neighbors to be able to connect to services versus a top-down approach. So next slide. So how have we evolved? I talked about the first two. The COVID Response Fund was another way where foundations, new community foundations and United Ways had an ear to the community, and they could get the money out quicker than any individual foundation could do. So there were funds that were directed, and I think it was about maybe $18 million, $13 million. There's a PowerPoint that I've included that while that was a first time for the Community Foundation and United Way to come together to really try to execute grant making really quickly, there were some pitfalls because of the disparities in where the money was granted based on current relationships versus, again, having that equity lens of who are the most vulnerable populations that are being impacted, and do we know the organizations that are hold trust in community to get the money out there. So you're going to see the Center for Civic Innovation did a really great kind of like evaluation of the Community Foundation Fund, the COVID Response Fund, with the help of Community Foundation and United Way and other folks. But they really had some key recommendations on continuing to increase transparency, to give to leaders of color, specifically women leaders, women of color who are nonprofit leaders, because they were the ones who got the smallest cut of any of the grant making, but know intimately the needs of their communities. And then to lighten the burden on the nonprofits to have to jump through the hoops for funders. I talked about the silos versus collective impact. For GGA, this has been a really great learning of coming together with all the Atlanta-based funders and the statewide funders. And they are now creating a kind of like strategy, global strategy to have through lines in racial equity and climate change, because we feel like those two are the most important areas that in all grant making need to have considerations. And so there's a lot of learning and collaboration going on right now around those two, really including those two in all your decision making. And then how do we remove barriers, structural and institutional, for access to philanthropy? Really addressing, how are we including organizations who may not have ever known about funders to build those relationships to address racial disparities. We have a Just Fund app that is creating a common app for Atlanta funders. There's about 20 foundations that are on this app, and we are looking at just creating one common app so that you don't have to apply 20 different times based on each foundation's personality. And I think that's a huge development for foundations in Atlanta, because it will remove a lot of burden on fundraising. And then there's a lot of work around seeing whiteness and just acknowledging that being white is a race, and there are privileges to being white, and how being colorblind is not helpful, and how do you implement that lens to be able to address equity and other people's lived experience. So lots of good things going on, but a lot of work to do. So we're not there yet. So next slide, please. And so as far as what Jessie Parker Williams has done, there's a program called Awake, Woke, and Work. You can Google it. They've got a website. It's awesome. But it's really kind of the new term for what diversity, inclusion, and equity mean. Diversity is awake. It's just knowing that there's diverse populations that are all around us. Woke is inclusion. So how are you implementing inclusion of lived experience in your workplace or in your personal life? And then work is when you actually are trying to do equity. And so some of the things that we did from the pandemic is, number one, we knew the workforce was going to be really burdened with stress, with everything that was coming at them. And so we offered free stress community resiliency model training, which is really teaching individuals and team leaders how to stay in their resiliency zone and how to build healthy coping mechanisms when they find themselves getting too anxious or angry or, or too down or deflated. What are healthy coping mechanisms that individuals can develop so that they don't turn to unhealthy coping mechanisms, and can continue to lead and be resilient through this time? We had talked to John because the closer we got to community, the more I saw that nonprofits did not have marketing departments, fundraising, folks. They were had big plans, but didn't have the people to execute them. And so I'm bringing to my board how we can host a fellowship with potential grad students from GSU to kind of have a loaned executive, but a loaned fellow to our grantees to do special projects during a time. And that way, even the internship is not a burden to the nonprofit, but the student or the fellow would get a diverse experience of working not only in nonprofits, but foundation work. There's also a company called Jumpstart that has some great track record and building capacity for fundraising for organizations who may not have a built-in system or even network with alumni or grateful patients. And so I'm excited about that. And I'm hoping our trustees will pick that up next year as well. And then I've just been offering, how do I build relationships with grantees that's not just writing the check, because that's just not me. And I come from a lot of different skill sets, with grant writing and campaign management and things like that. So I've offered to volunteer to look at grant proposals, to review case for supports, to help make connections with other peers or other funders. And then, of course, just checking in and providing support to our grantees has been huge during this time. We're also in the process, which you can see in the grant, of auditing our internal kind of institutional equity practices to see where are there areas of growth, what are our goals, and how do we change kind of the institutional tradition of philanthropy to make it more effective in addressing equity. And so we have a meeting in December with the trustees to really dig deep in these areas to say, are we happy with this? Is this where we want to be? Where do we want to go in the next 24 to 36 months? So next slide. That might be the end. So I won't go into the other PowerPoints, but one is from Neighborhood Nexus, which really gets into mapping and data and how communities can use that data at the community level to really start to develop shared outcomes or goals, and then bringing collective partnerships together to address those goals and meet regularly. I think that's kind of the wave of the future. I don't think any one organization can kind of operate, in a silo if you want to move community level outcomes and really change or move the needle, I guess. So that's one thing that I thought that presentation was really powerful. It also kind of illustrates how they're thinking about how we will come out of this pandemic, which economically, you've heard that it's a V or it's a W, but they're saying that coming out of the pandemic, it's going to be like a K, which means that the upper socioeconomic levels will bounce back And then the ones that were in the middle or lower will continue to decline in their outcomes unless there's some intention around those vulnerable populations. And so that's where we're moving our work toward, and probably our grant making in the next 24 to 36 months is really targeting those populations that were most impacted so that we don't see what happened from the recession, which is communities of color were impacted, but they never really recovered. And that is not what we want. And so, especially as it relates to health and child well-being. And so how do we think differently about our investments? And then the other PowerPoint was really the Center for Civic Innovations evaluation of how the way that philanthropy approached the COVID response was unequal, and how we can do better in the future. So that was 30 minutes right on the dot, and I'm open for questions. So
that was amazing. I don't think we need to use the chat necessarily. If you have questions, you might just want to pose them directly.
Aisha, I see you're talking. I don't hear you.
Aisha, you need to unmute. Yeah.
So I was double muted. I'm sorry.
Oh.
I thank you so much for that presentation. I think it was, I really appreciated the focus on women of color and underserved, nonprofit leaders. I thought that was, or undersupported nonprofit leaders. I thought that was really excellent. And I asked an additional question here, and then I realized it's not particularly clear. and what I was asking, I asked about, you mentioned the health in all perspectives. Or methodology that you're approaching, social determinants of health. And perhaps it wasn't seen very clearly, but I wanted to know if there are currently any organizations dedicated to the families that support patients. So, family caregivers, informal caregivers, and how, if those organizations are being supported by your foundation at all, and in what ways? I hope that's not too niche of a question, but it's kind of my field of experience and study, so I was curious to know.
Yeah, I love that you brought that up, because the Aspen Institute did a really phenomenal, 2-generation study. And I would even say 3-generation study is now, because of the way that grandparents are raising grandchildren. And then also just the 2-generation approach and the burdens. If you don't have childcare, then you can't, get your child back to school, and you're working remotely, and you can't go to work because your student is, your child is remote. And so there's all sorts of dynamics. And so we believe in that 2 to 3 generation approach, and lifting that up. And when we're looking at applications, that I do look for that as a benefit, because we know that it can't just be the child. Even with the school-based mental health, some of the providers are just providing services for the child, when we know training is needed for a family, same thing with physical health. And so how do you support that family unit for success? And then there's also the trauma-informed care and ACEs study, and how you can prevent ACEs by really taking that 2 or 3 generation approach of just being able to acknowledge and educate, and then prevent, into the future, since the parent is the primary buffering for a child from adversity. And so how do we build those systems to really value that? And we are engaged in that. So.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much.
Other questions? Observations, reactions?
Well, I have a question, John and Bonnie. You talked about CEOs of color receiving less funding. And I think that probably some of the reasons behind that are obvious to anybody who's been paying the slightest attention to the world they live in. But what do you find are the effective ways just to go about remedying that? For example, is part of the problem just being connected to the right networks of people and funders? But what can you effectively do to help those people get more funding in a way that really changes the dynamic for the future and not just a one-time thing?
I think that the onus is on us, and because we have been really proactively working outside of our network for the past 3 years, what I have done is tried to align myself with leaders in the space like the Partnership for Southern Equity, like Archie. I have been, if I'm on a call, I have been showing up to invitations with the intent that I want to build relationships with people that don't look like me. And when we do make grants to those organizations who are led by people of color, I am very intentional that after we make the grant, not before we make the grant, but after we make the grant, I invite them to breakfast and lunch, and I talk about systemic racism and how I acknowledge that it is more difficult to access funds if you are a person of color, and how can I be a better partner with that CEO or leader to help make those connections. And it's amazing when I've had those discussions. Number one, they're shocked that I'm even asking them this. Number two, they almost fall out of their chair, and then they are able to talk to me more openly and honestly about their challenges. And so as we've been going through this, I've been sharing our personal story a lot more with other funders to say, this is not rocket science. It really just takes picking up the phone and getting to know your grantees on a more personal level. And you might have to make more of an intentional effort than you would, the larger, more historical organizations, that are already in the game, What I've also learned is once I've had those conversations, then those folks talk to their peers, and then I start getting inquiries that I would have never gotten before. And so then I start talking and learning and listening, and it's led to our grant making being more effective in regard to getting money and investments to communities who might not have ever, been able to access that before. So from the nonprofit side, there's been a lot of, if I were a person of color on the nonprofit side, there's been a lot of publicity around this with the Chronicle of Philanthropy article. There's also a Bridgespan article that I sent that talks about philanthropy and racial equity. And so I think there's enough research that's coming out that that you can use that to your advantage to build relationships, but also a lot of funders are also keenly aware of it now. So
thank you. Well, if nobody else has a question, I'll ask you another very practical one. Since this is a virtual meeting, I guess maybe we'll have to depend on Amber or Darian, but you've mentioned a lot of resources, and is there a way that we can get links to some of the resources you've talked about?
Yes. Like linked as far as like long-term or just reading the referenced material?
Well, I meant reading the reference material, but long-term too, if you have.
Yeah. Well, I'm always available, so I don't mind. And you guys can get my contact information from John. So just keep in touch, and if there's anything I can do to help. But I will send out the strengthening the sectors report, the bridge span report, and I guess if I send it to John, John can get it to the forum. So
Yeah, yes, we can.
So I'll do that separately.
I was taken, Bonnie, when you talked about maybe I think you said all of the statewide grant folks had maybe put about $135 million into COVID relief. And this happens to me every election season when I see that somebody spent $100 million on a campaign or $85 million on a campaign. And I honestly think that there should be a public policy move to put a surtax on campaign spending, or to say that a certain percentage of campaign spending, 5% or whatever, has to go into a pot to be distributed by grants or something else. Because when I see the size and scope of that spending, and I think of what that money can do, and I think of how hard over the years it's been for us to raise money to make that difference, it just overwhelms me. And obviously that's very timely, but I still think it's a concept that's worth discussing.
It is. And that 135 million is just the icing on the state budget. I mean, that was probably a portion of the cuts from DCH of what kind of recession they had to do to level set with the COVID. It's and that's why I'm a strong believer in these public-private, the ability to make those relationships across those systems is tremendous, because we each play a role in helping the problem. It just isn't going to be effective if we're not doing that. If it's at a community-based level and then all the way up at the state level, but the community voices are what really help form policy change and create ecosystems that are better. So
absolutely,
advocacy, that's why it's so important.
A big part of it. Well, thank you, Bonnie. We're coming up on our 4 o'clock hour. We can't thank you enough. We definitely, we've recorded the session. We'll include those extra links and PowerPoint that you sent us. And if there's anything else, you can send it to me, and I'll make sure that our students get a copy of that. With that, Darian, do you have any other things that you might want to cover or close before we leave?
No, that was all. For just a reminder for the person who just joined, if you're not a member, please reach out to myself or Amber if you have any questions about joining. And if you are a member, we are currently accepting applications for the e-board all the way until November the 30th.
And I would like to add that our fall crowdfunding site just went up today. That's where we are raising funds to pay for our students to meet all the requirements to earn their CMP. And that includes the preparation for the exam, the professional development session they need to go to. So it's very important. And we'll be pushing that out to other folks and seeking their support. But that is up and active now on the Georgia State website, under giving, under annual funds, crowdfunding. So just wanted to mention that. Amber, anything you would like to add as the wonderful campus director of the Nonprofit Leadership Alliance?
No, I think everyone covered it. Thank you so much, Bonnie, for joining us today and sharing your wisdom and your learning from this experience. It was very eye-opening, and I think our students really appreciate you joining us and being able to share that with us. And thank you, Darian, for starting us off. Appreciate you and all that you've done for us this semester, keeping us going. And all of you for joining us. Thank you so much. I know your schedules are crazy and things are still a mess, but appreciate you joining us and being a part of us this semester. We should hopefully have our spring schedule available at the beginning of January, but please keep a lookout for our newsletters and our Instagram for any other opportunities or things that might be coming up.
Excellent. I think let's give a big round of applause for Bonnie. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Take care.
All right, bye. Have a great week, students.